Hey everyone, hope you're having a great day. Yesterday we went over what makes a government legitimate in terms of creating a state, and hopefully at this point you've gotten to see, hey, why is government necessary, and why government is helpful, and then what makes a legitimate government in the first place in terms of how do we know something is a government and how do we know it isn't. But now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and discussing what type of government is best. And this is a little tricky. It's not as easy. Every governmental system has its advantages. So I want you to begin thinking off, what type of government do you think the United States is? And think about that for a minute. So there are many different types of governments in the world. But in this class we're really going to kind of focus down and narrow down on democracy and dictatorship. There are forms of government like an oligarchy or a monarchy, and there's even different types of democracies like constitutional monarchies. However, we're really going to focus on the type of democracy that America adheres to. And in this lesson we're going to address dictatorships as well, because really when it comes down to it, much of the world is either in one of these two types of governments. They're either dictatorships or a democracy. But let's first take a look at a different type of government, which is a democracy. A democracy is, naturally speaking, is the idea that the people vote for the decisions that the government makes. In other words, the people they rule themselves. They are the ones who make decisions on whether to go to war or whether to help someone out or hurt someone or enforce a certain penalty or custom. And inherently, this is built into the United States government. We are inherently a democracy, in the sense that the people direct the government. They give the government power. They, in a sense, we believe in self-rule, that we should be able to determine our own destiny, be able to determine what types of things we think the law should protect and what types of things we think the law should enforce and whatnot. So there's this idea in democracy that the people of the state determine the decisions the state makes collectively, and that the government gets its right to rule from the people themselves. This is Thomas Hobbes had this social contract theory, and we're going to explore that a little bit, which John Locke maybe developed a little bit further. We're going to explore that more in the second unit, but if you went back to just section 2 of chapter 1 in your textbook, you'd see that this idea of a social contract is that the people give the government power to rule in favor of stability and order. But ultimately, government gets its right to rule from the people. And this is this theme that we're going to talk about later this year. It's going to be a word that we're going to go over numerous times. I'm going to introduce it right now, and it's called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is simply the will of the people to give the government the ability to enforce laws. In other words, the government gets its sovereignty, its ability to make and enforce laws within a border without any interference from the people themselves. The people themselves are the ones who give government. And this is essentially where this it has its roots in democracy. And so in some ways the United States is a democracy, and that's why we have that's why you'll hear we are a democratic country. But it's more probably accurate to say we have a democratic form of government than we are a democracy. And I'll go into that because a democracy in its pure form has many problems, and we are not a democracy in its pure form. First off, consider the fact that in a democracy, everyone, in a pure democracy at least, everyone has the ability to make its decisions. Everyone is entitled to self-rule. And this presents problems. So does everyone make a decision? Everyone make a decision on small matters? Because that's kind of what has to happen in democracy, where government makes decisions. So I want to put this in perspective. Let's say that we take democracy in its pure form, which is really direct democracy, and we just say in the city of Harrisburg that everyone in the city, all 50,000 of them, actually it's 48,950 to be exact, was simply going to vote on where we are going to put a new basketball court. Since everyone is involved in this decision, especially in direct democracy, we're going to have to vote on such issue. We're going to have to give time for people to debate. And we're going to have to give time for people to give their opinion. So first off, we have to have a place to meet. And let's just say the biggest place in Harrisburg to meet would probably be an arena, which holds around 17,000 people. So if we give everyone only 1 minute to speak, obviously some are probably going to speak more than others, but on average, let's say 1 minute, it's going to take 17,000 minutes just to discuss where to put the basketball court. And just so you know, that equals about 708 days. Oh, and you're also going to have to do that 3 times because the arena can only hold 17,000 people. It can't hold close to 50,000 people. So in all, just to talk about where to put a basketball court in the city the size of Harrisburg, it's going to take over a little over 5.5 years. That's the problem with direct democracy. Imagine if this were actually a decision that had much more weight in terms of what resources we're going to cultivate, how we're going to make sure everyone gets equal water, how are we going to make sure that the crime or the punishment for a crime is fair and just. We simply don't have the time. And even in the representative democracy, debate is slow and decisions are time consuming. So that's just the issue with a pure democracy in general, is the time part of it. The other part of democracy that's a problem is majority rule. Now, you might be thinking, well, majority rule, what's wrong with that? You know, that shows the will of the people, and the will of the people vote on the government or vote on decisions the government makes, and majority rules. It's easy, it's simple. Everyone votes, and it's problem solved, right?
Mr. Flagger, what do you got going on this summer?
Majority rule in a pure democracy is essentially rule by mob. It's, if you've ever been to somewhere where the crowds just seem to be moving and people are doing things in the crowd that maybe they wouldn't do by themselves, that's essentially what democracy is. And in majority rule, there's a couple problems. First off, the rights of the minority may be trampled. If the majority wants to take your property, for example, too bad for you. They vote on it, too bad for you. And this has happened in China in 2008, which technically China, although it's communist, is a democracy. They would call themselves the People's Democratic Republic. They just, and this has happened numerous times, just decided to take property for the Olympics. That's what happens to the majority. Too bad for you. So there's no protections for the minority. The majority itself can be wrong, and there's no checks against the majority. Sometimes, as you know, popular opinion is not always right. For example, Adolf Hitler was elected by Democratic majority. That's not to say everyone in the country in Germany at the time voted for him, but he had majority rule. He had the most amount of votes. So sometimes the majority isn't right. Nor does a simple majority always mean that there's a widespread agreement, as I just mentioned with Hitler in Germany, for example. Let's say 49 of 100 people decided that a new road should not be built over a historic monument. How would it feel to know that only one person made the difference? This type of leadership isn't good leadership either. Think about it. If you're trying to rule a country and pretty much half your country is mad at you, how does that show that you're being a man of the people? You're not. And that's the problem with democracy. So if democracy doesn't... What about dictatorship? First, I just want you to take this quick quiz question on problems of democracy, and we'll talk about dictatorship. In a dictatorship, one person rules the state. One person determines the laws, and they enforce the laws. Dictatorships can include empires, monarchies, and they could actually include democracies as well. Someone could be popularly elected in a democracy, and then they determine the laws and how those laws are enforced. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, for example, would have been considered to some degree a dictator in a democracy. He's popularly elected, but he pretty much determined all the laws and how to enforce them. The one advantage of dictatorships is that you can make decisions very quickly, and there's not this debate. It's usually what one person thinks. Now, typically in a dictatorship, they will even have advisors, and because one person cannot be an expert on anything, but one person makes decisions, and this allows things to happen very, very quickly. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. This does not mean necessarily that dictatorships are bad. And take the reign of Napoleon, for example, who declared himself Emperor of France, first prefect and emperor. Napoleon is arguably one of the best rulers of the modern age. He, for example, put in systems where only the most efficient and capable people of government would rule. He conquered lands for France that most people in France supported. In fact, so much so that when he was exiled by England and Prussia, and he came back to France and he was welcomed with open arms. He was a type of person who you didn't necessarily want to criticize publicly, but if you criticized him privately, he would actually listen and make those changes depending on what you said, if he agreed with it, but he would actually listen in private. In public, not so much. He, at the time it was coming out of the French Revolution, freedom of religion really wasn't protected. He reinstituted that again. So Napoleon is someone who's always debated through history on whether he is a good dictator or a bad dictator. So dictatorships aren't necessarily bad. The issue that often comes with dictatorships is that there is a human tendency to abuse power. And when one person is making all decisions, first off, like I said, they're not always an expert in all circumstances. They're going to make mistakes. And then secondly, there's nothing to check their power. There's nothing to prevent them from making a mistake or from abusing power and abusing the rights of the minorities or even the majority for his benefit. And this was really the issue with Hitler and the Weimar Republic, where there wasn't checks against the decisions he was making, and therefore was able to consolidate power really, really fast. So more times than not, without checks, dictatorships happen, and more times than not, dictatorships aren't good. So a couple examples of dictatorships in the past: Joseph Stalin, Napoleon, Adolf Hitler, Kim Jong-il, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia. These would all be forms of dictatorships. And even take King Abdullah, for example, a lot of people in Saudi Arabia like him, even though he makes decisions that maybe you wouldn't agree with. But still, it goes to show sometimes people like a dictatorship. So if a democracy is bad, majority rule specifically, and dictatorship is more times than not bad, then what? How do we get a government that works for the people, prevents anarchy, but balances the needs of the state with the people? This would be a republic. A republic is a type of representative democracy. It does have a democratic form to it. This is why I said the United States, in some ways, democratic. In a republic, however, we typically have representative democracy. This puts a check on the majority because people have to represent everyone in their district or coming from the area that they are coming from. Government in a republic is not just controlled by a simple majority, but law as well. And the law prohibits the majority from making laws that would violate the rights of the minority. So in a republic, we see various protections for the minority, such as the idea that the minority one day can become the majority, or the idea that government itself has to abide by all the laws and it's not exempt, even if people want them to be. Nor can they make decisions telling people how to act, maybe to violate their conscience. Sometimes that does not happen in a republic. But in a republic, we still allow the will of the people to act when it comes to making decisions. That's why in Congress, for the most part, our legislative body that makes laws, it is ultimately a majority rule. In the Senate, it's a little bit more complex. Majority rule simply doesn't rule the day, so to speak. But oftentimes, we see majority rule. We see that in the Supreme Court when they make decisions on laws. It's a simple vote. And so there are aspects of democracy, but the biggest difference with a republic and a democracy is that the rights of the minority are protected, and as John Adams said, it's a republic of laws, not men. In conclusion, a democracy sounds good in theory, but ultimately a simple majority has its problems. Dictatorial style government are often very efficient, and they can be fair, but most times they're not. A republic is the type of democracy that places limits on majority rule.